Sweet. Well, welcome. So my name's Lyric. I wear many hats. I'm involved in this community and the general community in a lot of ways. Most pertinent to this class, I've been intensively homesteading for the past 5 years, growing and preserving lots and lots of food, and I have a very special affinity for drying foods and getting people excited about doing that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I've dried hundreds of pounds of food every year for myself and my family, and it's pretty simple. So I was thinking we could start by talking about like all of the different like main methods of food preservation. Drying is like one of several, and so I don't know if y'all could think of some other methods of food preservation. We could like popcorn around and talk about the pros and cons. Canning.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, so I do a lot of canning. Canning is a really useful tool. It's very different than drying. It's like almost the exact opposite of drying because you're sealing in all of the moisture into your jar with pressure, which is wonderful because it's ready to eat out of the jar, so that's a pro. But like, what are some of the cons of canning? Like, maybe not as strong as a con, but some of the pieces.
Bacteria?
Yeah, bacteria. Yeah, so
Just
canning has way more food safety considerations than drying because largely in part you're sealing in all of that moisture. So if you don't do it correctly, you don't have enough pressure, you can create like the perfect environment for bacteria and things like botulism to live. So that's a big consideration. There's way more technicalities with something like canning than drying. Yeah, and with that, in order to be as food safe as possible, you need like all of this certain equipment, which can be low cost depending on what you're canning. You might need a pressure canner, or you could do a hot water bath, but really you're looking at needing like several pieces of specialized equipment. You always need to get new jar lids when you're canning. You don't need that when you're drying. So there's a lot more like cost and like specificity to canning. Yeah, what are some other methods of food preservation? Like freezing. Yeah, so I also do a lot of freezing. Freezing is great because it's really easy. It's like my lazy method of food preservation. Like if I don't have time, I just like throw it in my freezer until I don't have any space in my freezer, and then that's when it becomes a problem. Freezing, like in that vein, is very bulky. With drying, we'll talk more about the pros and cons of drying, but you're taking away a lot of the mass, and so you're able to like condense and shrink things, whereas in the freezer you just put the whole thing in there and it's really big and bulky. I have 3 freezers and they're like completely full because it just doesn't stuff down. But pros are that it's really easy and you're keeping your food in a really versatile form. You could take it out and dry it, you could take it out and cook it, you could ferment it, all sorts of different things. So you're keeping it you're basically just pausing it until you're ready to use it, which is great. The other con of freezing is that you need like electricity long term. You have to keep your freezer running, and that can be really devastating if your power goes out for a long time. You can like lose a lot of food, so that's pretty significant. Then we also have fermenting, which is great because you're adding all sorts of probiotics into there. And so that's like a lacto ferment with like salt and water. You do need to refrigerate that, so that's that ongoing electricity again. But like, I don't know, a benefit and a con is that you're actually like transforming the food. You know, you take a cucumber and you turn it into a pickle, and it's a totally different eating experience. So that can be really cool, or it can be kind of a bummer if you just wanted cucumbers, I suppose. Anything else? Any other?
Have you tried drying cucumbers?
I have not. I was just thinking that as I was saying those words, like a cucumber chip.
I got to the point where the only thing that I canned were acidic things like fruit and tomatoes. But it would be, everything like green beans and stuff I froze. But I never tried, I didn't ever try drying cucumbers.
Yeah, that's a great experiment. I mean, and that leads into like one of the main things that I love about drying is that you like can tap into a whole different relationship with the foods. in a very intuitive and like individualized way, because foods dry very differently. They take different amounts of time, they have different textures, different flavors when they're done, and so you can kind of like access this whole different like connective piece with the plants and foods that you're growing, which is really fun. Okay, other benefits to drying. I'm mostly going to talk about drying because that's what this workshop is about. So I want to really hype up the drying, because it's a really amazing method for preserving all sorts of things. So we already know it's very space efficient. You can store a lot of mass in a small amount of space after you remove the water. Anything else?
I don't know that I can say this for sure, but do you think that you can preserve the flavor and the taste of things better drying than you can with canning?
I think so. There's a lot of research that you are preserving a lot more nutrients when you're drying at low heat versus canning, and so a lot of nutrients are like very connected to their flavor profile. Like really high quality food tastes better, and so I think that dry food tastes a lot fresher and better, and you're changing, not only like the mass properties of the food, but also like the flavor profile, because as you remove all of the water, you're like concentrating all of the other flavors. So like things like dried fruit, which we have like some samples of here, apples and peaches, they're gonna taste way sweeter. Other foods, like herbs, you might need a 1/3 cup fresh basil in a recipe, or like a tablespoon dried basil, because it's so much stronger dried. So that's another cool benefit. I think the flavor can be a lot better. It's just a different eating experience too than canned. But yeah.
I guess it's like lighter too for like bringing it places.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about like some of the uses for a dehydrator, which is I do a lot of backpacking, and so I'll make entire meals with like my beautiful high quality homegrown food, and then dehydrate the whole thing and take it in the backcountry instead of buying those little like packets of dehydrated stuff from the store. So you can like really bulk up and like meal prep pretty hardcore with the dehydrator too. So other benefits, you are creating something really versatile, like certain things like apples or peaches. You could choose to rehydrate them to eat them. You could add them into a dessert or something like that, or you could eat them just like as a dried snack. You can make all sorts of like products with your dried herbs. Like this is some garlic salt that I made with garlic that I grew and dried, like herbal bath salts with a bunch of flowers that I grew and dried, like a cayenne muscle rub with cayenne peppers that I grew and dried. So you can get like really creative with it on the back end too, and like kind of store up a big jar of possibilities for when you have a lot of time. So I was going to start by talking about foods that you don't need a dehydrator to dry, at least like the simplest and safest, easiest to dry without a dehydrator. So for me, in my experience, those are herbs, so like fresh herbs that are really leafy, like this rosemary seeds, seeds for saving obviously, but also seeds for eating, like popcorn or beans. Hot peppers dry really easily without electricity, and then mushrooms and flowers. I have a lot of ease drying those. So for herbs, the age-old method is to hang dry them, right? Something a lot of people don't think about, and that you might find some conflicting information on the internet about. Some people dry their herbs like in direct sunlight. I don't recommend doing that. I've never done that, especially for medicinal herbs. Like a lot of the aromatic oils and medicinal value in here is like pretty fragile, and you'll totally roast it if you put it in the direct sun after cut. So I always hang dry herbs in a really well ventilated space. So for me in my house, which is not very well ventilated, that means like in a doorway where there's like a ceiling fan blowing, so that can be a great place. Maybe you have a floor fan you could set up, or you have a house with air conditioning, which would make things really easy. but you don't want to do it in the kitchen, because the kitchen or the bathroom, really, those are going to be like the moistest place in any house. And so you want to avoid those spaces. And so you can just use a rubber band the stems together at the top, and then just hang it with a clothespin or push pin or whatever you have. And then you're checking back regularly to check for like crispness and dryness in your leaves. And we'll talk about drying herbs in a dehydrator too, because there's a slightly different method. But that's essentially it for herbs. And then once you're done, you'll need to do what's called garbling. And so that's removing like the leafy part of the herb from the stem. Like, so this is rosemary, right? And the stem of this is like really hard and woody, and I don't want to eat it. And so once I'm done drying, like say, I pulled a piece out of my bundle, and I could just strip off the leaves like this. If I was drying herbs in my dehydrator, I would do this part first, and I would garble it before I put it in there. And that can be a little bit easier, but I wouldn't do that hanging, because with something like rosemary, it doesn't do it as much, but maybe something like basil, if you were to chop it up, garble it, and then, try to dry it without electricity, what you've just done is created a bunch of surface area. You've cut up the herb, and so you've made all these cross sections where the cells are exposed, and that's just going to create a bunch of places for mold and bacteria to emerge. And so I never garble first if I'm hang drying. I'll always hang it whole and then garble later. And so while we're talking about garbling, say I pulled this rosemary off and it's really dry, you have a couple different options, and people prefer different things, because obviously these are like pretty big sprigs. They would be a little smaller if they were dried, but these are pretty big sprigs to cook with. And so I'll often dry it pretty whole leaf and store it pretty whole. I'll dry it whole leaf, and then I'll store it pretty whole leaf. This is basil, and then you could either do this, you can store it whole leaf, and then as you're ready to use some, you can pull it out and do a little palm method, which I really love. Yeah, we have a fan of the palm method. And then you can grind it up real small like that, and then it's just this sweet connective moment with your herbs. So I do like that ritual. And you can also kind of grind it and garble it in the jar. I have a really cool tool for this that is very simple. It's just a branch that my husband whittled down a little bit. And so you can actually take, you might have something like this in your kitchen, the back of a spoon or something like that, and you can just smash down in there, and you can get it really, really ground up that way. So a couple different methods for garbling, but I'll always store the herbs just whole leaf without the stems. So that's a good consideration too, because if you get all these woody stems in there, it's just not going to be a very pleasant eating experience. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Particularly with basil. Because I have not been able to get it to dry nicely. It turns black. How do you? Yeah.
So that's one of the trade-offs with like air drying or like not using a process. It doesn't like arrest the decomposition as quickly as the dehydrator, so it might be fully dry and safe to eat, but like that color quality has deteriorated a little bit. I found that too for several different types of foods. That's a trade-off, but as long as it smells really good and it's really crisp to the touch, like it's totally safe and good to eat. Just might not be quite as pretty. And so seeds are pretty self-explanatory. They mostly dry themselves. You don't want to like heat dry your seeds if you're saving them to plant. And then foods that are seeds, you can they're basically just designed to dry themselves. You can hang them up. You can just spread them, like shell your beans, spread them on a cookie sheet with, some paper towels, kind of shuffle them up once a day or so, and they'll be good to go. So those are really easy breezy. Hot peppers are also really easy breezy, which is amazing because the capsaicin in the pepper is like an antibacterial, so it'll prevent a lot of mold and bacteria from happening. and they're also so beautiful. So if you dry hot pepper, or if you grow hot peppers, I recommend drying them like this. You can hang them around your house, again, like well-ventilated spot, maybe in your doorway, and then just use them as you need, or you could jar them up after they're fully dried. These are like partially dry. You can see they're still bendy. They're in the process. So those are really easy. And then mushrooms are the other one that I've had the most success without using any electricity. And they're the opposite of the fresh herbs in that you actually do want to put them out in the sun because they're magic and they will absorb extra vitamin D sitting out in the sun, and so you can like enhance the nutrient value of your mushrooms doing it that way. And so with the mushrooms, you just want to slice them really thin. This is a reishi. This is a lot of reishi mushroom, which grows wild here. And so you just want to slice them really thin, and this is true for anything that is like a fruiting body that you would need to cut up. We'll talk about it with the dehydrator. But you want them around a 1/4 inch, thinner if you can, they'll dry faster. But right around a 1/4 inch, and then cutting everything really evenly. Anything that you're going to cut and dry, having it be around the same width is going to make it all dry around the same time. So mushrooms you can dry out in the sun. A really great place is actually like in the dashboard of your car, because it gets really hot in there and it's sunny, and then it's safe from bugs, like you were mentioning bugs. And so that's a really great kind of trick for drying mushrooms. Yeah, so those are all my recommendations for like best beginner, no electricity drying. You can also do things like before the workshop we were talking about sun-dried tomatoes or dried fruits, things like that. It gets a little more complicated because you have humidity, you have insects, you have mold, and so I would recommend starting with what's been talked about already, and then maybe moving to a dehydrator if you get more excited, or just like trial and erroring some other like a little more advanced foods. The basic rule of thumb is that the higher the moisture content of the food, the more complicated it's going to be to dry without electricity. I don't think I gave like the official definition of dehydrating, but you're removing the moisture, you're removing the water content, and so that's going to be harder with something really juicy, and it's just going to, what is that?
Like a cucumber.
Yeah, maybe like a cucumber. Yeah, I'm thinking like things like berries that are like a blueberry that's like self-contained, like it's like fully sealed, like, you know, you wouldn't go and cut all your blueberries in half, but it's like this little nugget of juice, and so that might be challenging to dry without a dehydrator. I haven't spent very much time with it because I bought a dehydrator. This isn't mine, but I have a very similar one, basically as soon as I got into drying food. So if people have specific questions, like, we could talk about it more, but I won't spend too long on that. And so then talking about foods in the dehydrator, this is an Excalibur Dehydrator. This is the same one that I have almost. I think mine's a little bit newer, but it has all of these trays inside. And so you pull out the tray and you lay the foods here. I also have, for mine, I have sheets like that don't have holes. They're kind of like wax paper type sheets that are totally reusable, that you can put if you have something really crumbly or really wet and liquidy that would not do well with the holes. And so this is what I use for most of what I dry, what I use for these dried apples and peaches. And so the main consideration is cutting things to, like, as I was saying, like the same width. And then as you spread them out in your dehydrator, you want them not to touch. And so I'll just do like a really quick example of this with an apple to see what it's going to look like. And then the great thing about dehydrators is that there's all sorts of resources online, and it comes with instructions, and even on the top of this one it tells you the different temperatures that different foods will do best at. So this is just a really quick example. If I were to cut up this whole apple and dehydrate it, I would lay it all out on here, and I would make sure that there's space in between each of the apple slices, and that's gonna allow the airflow in there to get all around all the different slices and dry them really nice and even. The benefit of the dehydrator is that this is exactly what it's designed to do, and you're not like kind of having to like engineer and innovate. We'll talk about the oven drying method, which you do have to do that a little bit with that. Totally doable, but this is basically a one-stop shop. You were mentioning earlier, it does take up space. It's a big one. So if you don't have counter space for it, you know, maybe keep it in storage, maybe pull it out when you use it. Mine is just on at all times in the summer. It's just like part of my counter at this point. I don't even know what my counter looks like without it on there. So if you use it a lot, it can kind of just blend itself in. You could also set it up in a different room, not in your kitchen, on a shelf in a different room on the floor or something like that. They can be really affordable if you find them secondhand. Even this one, or mine that's very similar, I think it was like maybe $90, and I've had it for about 5 years, and it works perfectly, and it's very literally on at all times. So they have some gumption to them. So if you're getting serious about drying food, I would recommend buying one. If you don't have a dehydrator, you can do oven drying. It's a little bit trickier because with drying, especially foods like apples, peaches, like things that are juicy, you want to be keeping your temperature under around 160, 140, because above that you're actually going to be cooking the food. And so that's going to start to break down some of the enzymes, which is going to increase the chance that it's going to spoil as it's stored. And then you're losing like some nutrients and all of that. But a lot of times when you bake apple chips in the oven, you know, you might find a recipe online, bake apple chips at 300 degrees for however long amount of time. That's a great snack, but it's not going to last long term in storage. You know, these foods we're going for like months to years in storage, but they're going to start to break down. So if you do dry in the oven, most ovens have that warm setting, and that's what you're going to want. Unless you have like one of the newer fancy ovens, you can adjust to like 130, maybe even lower. But if you have that, you can do that. A lot of us have older ovens, and so you can put it on the warm setting. Cut things and spread them out just like this, but on that cookie tray. And then you just have to be kind of on it. With the dehydrator, you'd like throw it in, walk away, forget, and then come back. With the oven, you really want to be checking. Ovens often have like a hot spot, so they could be drying unevenly, so you might need to like flip things, you know, switch the tray around, things like that. And even that warm setting, unless you are able to look up for your oven specifically, it might be over 160. It could be like 200 or so. So a lot of people will do this process with their oven door cracked open. This is great in the winter because it might take 10, 12 hours to dry something in your oven like that. But if you don't want your oven open all summer, you know, that you can see that could be an issue. So you can totally dry things in the oven. You want to be aiming between 120 and 140 degrees. That warm setting is going to be helpful. And then just monitor it. Open the oven now and again, even if you don't leave it fully cracked open. That'll help the moisture release as well. Kind of suction it out of there. And then you would go about storing your foods just as you would the dehydrated things. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Oh, and I did want to mention too, one of the other amazing things about my dehydrator is that I can do those fully prepared meals, and you know, do like a whole 9 trays of meal prep, and condense a very large amount of food into, you know, whenever I need it, and that'll last for a really long time. Okay, and then the final thing I'll say about any type of dehydrating, especially in your dehydrator, also in your oven, you don't want to add oil. I often see like recipes online for like apple chips or something, like dehydrated apple chips, and they like toss it in coconut oil, which is like the antithesis of dehydrating, because it's gonna coat your food and like lock in the moisture, and even if the moisture can escape, adding oil into dried foods is just like a recipe for rancidity. It's not going to last as long. So don't ever add oil. You might add lemon juice. You can see these apples are like already turning brown. So if you're a stickler about that, you could add lemon juice. I didn't add lemon juice on these for reference, and I think they look beautiful, but I don't know, some people might have aesthetic. This is cinnamon, by the way, it's not brown. Some people might have aesthetic reasons to use lemon juice, but never add oil. That is very silly and doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, and so now I'm going to talk about like storing your dehydrated foods, unless folks have questions so far. Okay, cool. So obviously you want a really airtight container, and I recommend mason jars because you can like really crank them really good. Actually, that one wasn't really cranked. You can really crank them really good. Also, these are great. They're really tight sealing. What's not so great is, like, this is like a baby food jar. It doesn't really, actually, this is my jar that's like stuck permanently forever, but I brought it as an example. It doesn't fully seal very well. Same for something like this is like an old pasta jar. And you might, it might last for a while, but the seal inside of this lid is not designed to last near as long as the mason jar, and this one twist is just like not really gonna do it for me. So I recommend mason jars, or these like, you know, what are these called, like push top, lever jars, with the rubber ring. Those can be really good. You can also use plastic bags. Like I had this plastic bag of reishi. You just want to make sure it doesn't have holes in it, because they can be sneaky. I've gotten bags from the store for freezing that just like come with holes in them, and so there can be some trickiness there. But you know, you can squeeze it and like see that it's holding air. This bag, I just tied it at the top, and I would not, I'm getting away with this because this is not for eating, and I was out of large jars at the time, but this is not really going to cut it for long-term storage. Like, plenty of air could get in there very easily. This is like kindling for my fire. This is like corn cores for the wood stove, but I would not recommend doing this. I also would really recommend most Tupperwares. They're good for keeping stuff in the fridge, but again, just not airtight. Along with the airtight piece, something people don't think about is actually when you're using the foods is being really mindful to not get a single drop of water in there. It's really easy to do, you know, if I'm cooking on the